The heat from the oven pressed against Emily like a physical weight. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of flour across her skin. It was Sunday, and Sunday meant dinner with Richard and Susan. She pulled the heavy ceramic roasting pan out of the oven, placing it on the counter with a dull thud. The smell of rosemary and garlic, usually a comfort, now just made her stomach twist. She checked the clock on the wall. It was 4:15. They would be here in exactly 15 minutes because Richard and Susan were never late. They believed lateness was a flaw of character, a sign of a disorganized life. Emily smoothed her apron, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. She looked at Mark. He was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone, completely detached from the quiet panic unfolding around him. "You could help me set the table," Emily said, keeping her voice light, keeping the frustration tucked away. Mark did not look up from his screen. He simply waved a hand in the air. "You do it so much better," he murmured, entirely missing the point. It was not about doing it better, she thought. It was about doing it together. But Emily swallowed the words the way she always did. She gathered the good plates, the heavy white ones with the silver trim. Susan had gifted them for their wedding with a very pointed comment about setting a proper table for a proper family. Emily carried the plates into the dining room, setting them down one by one. She adjusted the napkins, making sure the folds were perfectly straight. If they were not straight, Susan would notice. Susan noticed everything. The doorbell rang a sharp, piercing sound that made Emily flinch. Mark finally stood up, brushing a non-existent crumb from his shirt. He walked to the front door, opening it wide. Richard and Susan stepped inside, bringing the cold autumn air in with them. Susan handed Mark her coat, a heavy wool garment that smelled of expensive perfume and dry cleaning. Richard clapped his son on the shoulder, a loud, booming greeting. Emily stood in the hallway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She forced a smile onto her face. "Welcome," she said, her voice sounding thin even to her own ears. Susan turned her gaze toward Emily. Her eyes swept over the flour on Emily's forehead, the slightly damp hair, the worn apron. "Well," Susan said, her voice smooth and polished, "you certainly look like you have been working hard." It was not a compliment. It was an observation of Emily's failure to look effortless. Emily thanked her, ignoring the sting. They moved into the dining room, the chairs scraping against the hardwood floor. Richard took the head of the table as if it were his own house. Mark sat to his right, leaving Emily to manage the serving dishes and the drinks. She poured the wine, filling Susan's glass just below the rim. Susan took a sip, her lips pressing together in a tight line. A bit warm, Susan noted, setting the glass down, but perfectly fine for a casual Sunday. Emily sat down, the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. She looked at her husband, waiting for him to say something to defend the wine or the meal or her. Mark just took a bite of his roll, staring blankly at the centerpiece. The conversation flowed entirely around Emily. Richard talked about the market, about investments, about the future. The future was a heavy word in this family. It meant legacy. It meant children. Susan steered the conversation exactly where she always did. "I ran into Helen at the club yesterday," Susan said, cutting a small, precise piece of meat. She was showing off pictures of her new grandson. "He is just beautiful. Such a blessing for their family line." Susan paused, looking directly across the table at Emily. "It makes you realize," Susan continued, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "how empty a house can feel without the sound of little feet. We are not getting any younger, Mark. Your father and I want to see our legacy continued." Emily felt her throat close up. The roast in her mouth turned to ash. She looked at Mark again, silently, pleading with him to intervene, to say they were happy, to say they had time to say anything at all. Mark cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. He looked at his father, then at his mother, and then he looked down at his plate. "The food is great, Em. Mark said, completely changing the subject. "Pass the potatoes, please." He let the comment hang in the air, thick and suffocating. He let Emily absorb the full weight of his mother's disappointment. He used her as a shield, hiding behind her silence. Emily picked up the bowl of potatoes, her hands trembling just slightly. She passed them to her husband, feeling a cold, hollow space opening up inside her chest. The dinner dragged on, an endless cycle of subtle digs and silent retreats. Emily sat there chewing food she could not taste, smiling a smile that did not reach her eyes. She was drowning in this dining room, and her husband was perfectly content to sit on the shore and watch. After the dessert plates were cleared away, Richard and Susan finally prepared to leave. They stood in the foyer, putting on their coats, making plans for next week. "We will do this again," Richard announced, as if issuing a command. Susan leaned in, kissing the air right next to Emily's cheek. "Take care of yourself." "Emily," Susan whispered, patting her arm. "You look tired. Perhaps you should rest more so you are ready for whatever the future holds." Emily nodded, unable to form words. She closed the door behind them, leaning her forehead against the cool wood. The silence of the house was sudden and ringing. Mark was already back on the living room couch, turning on the television. He had survived another Sunday. He was safe. Emily turned around, looking at the mess in the dining room, the stacks of dirty plates, the half-empty wine glasses. She realized with a quiet, devastating clarity that she was not a partner in this marriage. She was the buffer standing between Mark and the expectations of his parents. She stood in the hallway for a long time, just breathing in the silence. The muffled sounds of a sports game drifted from the living room. Mark was relaxed, his feet propped up on the coffee table. He had escaped unscathed. Emily pushed herself away from the front door and walked slowly back into the kitchen. The mess was overwhelming, a mountain of heavy white plates and half-eaten food. She turned on the faucet, letting the hot water run over her hands. The heat was scalding, but she did not pull away. It grounded her in the present moment, keeping her mind from completely unravelling. She reached for a sponge, squeezing the green soap into the rough fibres. As she scrubbed the gravy boat, her thoughts drifted back to a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago. The sterile smell of the medical clinic filled her memory. Dr. Evans had sat across from her, holding a thick manila folder, looking deeply sympathetic. "Polycystic ovary syndrome," the doctor had said, her voice gentle but terribly clinical. "It is manageable, Emily, but it explains the difficulties you have been having. It means conceiving naturally will be a steep challenge, and it requires significant intervention." Emily remembered sitting in her car afterward, in the sprawling concrete parking lot. The engine was turned off. She had stared at the leather steering wheel for 45 minutes, letting the heavy tears fall silently onto her lap. She felt broken like a defective piece of machinery, failing at the one task her in-laws deemed essential for her existence. Her body was betraying her, holding on to a secret she did not want to keep. When she finally drove home, through the rush-hour traffic, she told Mark everything. He had held her on the grey sofa, stroking her damp hair. "We will get through this, Em," he had whispered, kissing her forehead. "It does not change anything about us or our family." But it did change things, she realised now, rinsing the suds from a crystal wine glass. It gave Richard and Susan a permanent target. And Mark, despite his gentle words, in the quiet privacy of their living room, had offered her to them on a silver platter. He never told his parents about the medical diagnosis. He never took his father aside and said, "Stop asking, it is complicated and it hurts her." Instead, he let his mother leave passive-aggressive voicemails about fertility diets and organic supplements. He let his father make booming, aggressive toasts about the fading family name at every holiday gathering. Emily placed the clean glass on the wooden drying rack. She looked at her own reflection in the dark kitchen window. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, older than her 34 years. How long, she wondered, had she been doing this exactly? How many Sunday dinners had she meticulously orchestrated, absorbing the thinly veiled insults so Mark could eat his roast beef in total peace? She was his shield, his dedicated emotional shock absorber, taking every blow so he never had to feel the impact of his own parents. She turned off the water. The sudden quiet in the kitchen was heavy and oppressive. She dried her hands on a checkered towel, staring intently at her gold wedding ring. It caught the dim yellow light from the stove overhead. She had spent 5 long years trying to earn her rightful place in this wealthy family, trying to prove her inherent worth through perfectly cooked meals, pressed napkins, and endless punishing patience. She had swallowed her own private grief over her body, failing her simply to manage Mark's discomfort with his parents' demands. She had made herself small so he could remain comfortable. A strange, icy feeling began to spread slowly through her chest. It was not burning anger, not exactly. It was a cold, pure clarity, a quiet, profound shift in the very foundation of her mind. She realized with terrifying, undeniable certainty that Mark was never going to protect her. He was deeply terrified of his father's booming voice and his mother's icy, judgmental stares. He would always, without fail, choose his own comfort over her dignity. He loved the peace she provided more than he loved her. Emily folded the damp dish towel, placing it neatly by the edge of the sink. She did not feel like crying anymore. The bitter tears belonged to the naive woman she was 3 weeks ago, the woman who still foolishly believed that if she just tried a little harder, she would finally be enough for all of them. She walked to the arched doorway of the dimly lit living room. Mark was laughing out loud at something on the television screen. He did not notice her standing in the shadows, watching him. He did not feel the massive shift in the air between them. "I am going to bed," Emily said, her voice incredibly flat, completely devoid of its usual accommodating warmth. Mark glanced casually over his shoulder, offering a lazy, unbothered smile. "Okay, honey," he said immediately, turning back to the bright screen. "Leave the rest of the pots in the sink. I will get to them in the morning." He would not get to them in the morning. He never did. Emily knew perfectly well she would wake up to a kitchen smelling of old grease and cold garlic. But tonight, for the very first time in 5 exhausting years, she did not care. She turned around and walked up the carpeted stairs, leaving him alone with the canned laughter and the glowing screen. She was entirely done trying to fix things that were not her fault. She was done being the buffer. The thought was a small, quiet rebellion, taking firm root in the dark. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long, dusty shadows across the floor. Emily stood in the doorway, holding her thick cotton robe tightly around her waist. The sink was exactly as she had left it. A greasy roasting pan sat on the counter, next to a towering stack of crusted white plates. The smell of cold garlic hung heavily in the stagnant air. For 5 long years, Emily would have felt an immediate surge of anxiety seeing this mess. She would have rushed to the sink, turning the hot water on, scrubbing furiously before Mark woke up. She would have erased the evidence of his neglect, protecting him from his own laziness. But today, Emily just looked at the mess and felt absolutely nothing. She walked past the sink, stepping carefully over a stray napkin on the hardwood floor. She reached for the coffee maker, measuring out exactly enough grounds for 1 single cup. She pressed the glowing button, listening to the soft, rhythmic dripping of the machine. She leaned against the cool granite counter, waiting patiently, taking deep, even breaths. 20 minutes later, heavy footsteps sounded on the carpeted stairs. Mark walked into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He wore a rumpled grey shirt and flannel pants. He stopped in the middle of the room, looking confusedly at the sink, and then at Emily. She was sitting at the small wooden breakfast table, sipping her black coffee, reading a paperback novel. "Morning, Mark," mumbled, scratching the back of his neck. "You did not clean the kitchen." "I did not," Emily said, turning a page in her book. Mark stood there waiting for an explanation, waiting for her to jump up and apologize. When she did not move, he sighed a loud, exaggerated sound of minor inconvenience. He opened the upper cabinet looking for a clean mug, but the only ones left were at the very bottom of the dirty stack. He grabbed a plastic travel cup instead, pouring himself the last few drops of the coffee. "I thought we were making eggs," Mark said, leaning heavily against the stainless steel refrigerator. "I already ate," Emily replied, not looking up from her chapter. "You know how to make eggs, Mark. The pan is in the bottom drawer." Mark frowned, clearly unsettled by this tiny shift in their daily script. He decided to ignore it, moving on to his usual weekend routine. "My mother called earlier," he said, taking a sip of his lukewarm coffee. "She wants us over next Sunday for a big brunch thing. She said something about discussing the summer house and legacy planning. You know how my dad gets when he wants an audience." Emily closed her book, marking her page with a small piece of paper. She looked directly at her husband. The morning light caught the deep, tired circles under her eyes. "You should go," Emily said, keeping her voice completely level, completely devoid of emotion. "I am sure they will love having you there." Mark blinked, lowering his plastic travel cup. "What do you mean?" he asked. "We are both going. She is expecting us exactly at noon." "I am not going," Emily said, taking another calm sip of her coffee. "I have decided to take the weekend for myself. I am going to stay home." Mark let out a short, nervous laugh, like she had told a strange joke. "You cannot be serious, Em. It is Sunday brunch. You know my mother expects us both. She will ask a million questions. She will make those pointed faces she always makes if you are not there to help her with the food." "That sounds like a lot for you to manage," Emily said, her tone perfectly mild, perfectly detached. "You will just have to tell her I was unavailable." "But why?" Mark pushed his voice, rising just a fraction. "Are you sick? Are you mad about last night? Come on, Em. Do not do this. You know I absolutely hate dealing with them by myself. My dad is going to corner me in the study about my career path. My mom is going to ask about the grandchildren thing again. I need you there to buffer it." He said the quiet part entirely out loud. He needed her to be the meat shield. Emily felt a profound, settling calm wash over her entire body. "I know you hate it," Emily said, looking him right in the eye. "But they are your parents, Mark, not mine. You will be fine." She stood up from the table, taking her empty ceramic mug to the sink. She placed it gently on top of the greasy roasting pan. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry or scream or demand that he finally defend her honor. She simply stopped playing the game. Mark followed her to the edge of the hallway, his panic starting to become visible. "You cannot just skip it," he insisted, his voice sounding thin and pleading. "It is not fair to leave me hanging like this." "What am I supposed to tell them? They are going to think something is wrong with our marriage." Emily paused at the bottom of the wooden staircase. She rested her hand on the smooth banister. She looked back at him, feeling a strange sense of pity. "Tell them whatever you want," she said softly. "Tell them I am resting. Tell them I have plans. Or you could just tell them the truth." "What truth?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "That I am tired," Emily said. "That I am simply too tired to sit at that table and be insulted while you eat your roast beef." Mark opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself, but no words came out. He was completely unequipped for a conversation where she did not immediately fold and apologize for upsetting him. He ran a hand nervously through his messy hair. He looked back at the kitchen, at the towering stack of dirty dishes, as if realizing for the very first time exactly how much she carried for him. Emily turned away from his silent, terrified stare. She walked up the stairs, her steps feeling lighter than they had in 5 years. The invisible burden she had dragged around was suddenly resting squarely on his shoulders. She had stepped off the ride, leaving him alone to face the music. The rest of the week passed in a strange, fragile quiet. Emily did not remind Mark to pick up his dry cleaning. She did not pack his gym bag or lay out his clothes. When Sunday morning arrived, the air in the bedroom was thick with unspoken tension. Mark stood in front of the full-length mirror, struggling with his dark blue tie. He kept glancing at her reflection in the glass. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing soft sweatpants and a loose cotton sweater. She was reading the Sunday paper, sipping chamomile tea. "Are you really doing this?" Mark asked, his voice tight with rising panic. "You are really going to let me go alone?" "I am," Emily said, not looking up from the printed page. "Tell your mother I say hello." Mark let out a sharp, frustrated breath. He grabbed his keys from the heavy wooden dresser, the metal jingling loudly in the quiet room. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, storming out of the bedroom without another word. The heavy oak front door slammed shut downstairs, rattling the windows in their frames. Emily sat perfectly still, listening to the engine of his car fading down the suburban street. A wave of profound, unfamiliar peace. "Oi, passen." For the first time in 5 long years, her Sunday did not belong to Richard and Susan. It belonged entirely to her. She spent the afternoon doing absolutely nothing of importance. She repotted a small fern on the back patio. She listened to a jazz record, letting the smooth saxophone notes fill the empty living room. She did not look at her phone. She did not check the time. She existed simply and quietly, without bracing herself for the next subtle insult. But underneath the peace, a quiet sorrow lingered. She realized how easily the gears of their marriage grinded to a halt without her constant oiling. She had managed his relationships, his calendar, his emotional comfort for so long that he had forgotten how to function as an adult within his own family. The peace shattered exactly at 4 in the afternoon. The front door opened, and Mark walked inside, bringing a storm cloud with him. He threw his car keys onto the entryway table with unnecessary force. He tore off his blue tie, balling it up in his fist. His face was flushed, and his jaw was clenched tight. Emily was sitting on the sofa, folding a warm blanket. She looked up as he marched into the living room, standing over her like a looming shadow. "Well," Mark said, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm, "I hope you enjoyed your little spa day at home, because my afternoon was an absolute nightmare." Emily smoothed a wrinkle in the soft grey fabric. "What happened?" she asked, her tone mild and unbothered. "What happened?" Mark repeated, his voice rising in genuine anger. "My mother happened. My father happened. They spent the entire brunch interrogating me about where you were. My mother kept making those dramatic sighs, asking if you were depressed or if our marriage was in trouble. She said it was incredibly disrespectful for you to just skip a family gathering without a formal excuse." Emily folded the blanket into a neat square. "And what did you tell her?" she asked softly. "I told her you were not feeling well," Mark snapped, pacing back and forth across the woven rug. "But she did not believe me. And then my father cornered me in his study, just like I always knew he would. He gave me a 30-minute lecture on taking control of my household. He said I was letting you dictate the terms of our family. He asked me again when we were going to get serious about having children. He said the legacy was depending on me and that I needed to get you on board." Mark stopped pacing, pointing an accusing finger at Emily. "It was humiliating, Em. I sat there for 3 hours taking all of their heat completely by myself. You completely abandoned me." Emily looked at his flushed, angry face. She saw the deep fear of his father masking itself as anger toward her. She felt a profound, overwhelming sadness for the man she had married. "You are 36 years old, Mark," she said quietly. "You are a grown man. Sitting with your own parents for 3 hours is not an abandonment. It is just Sunday dinner. It is not just Sunday dinner, Mark yelled, finally losing his temper. It is a minefield, and you are supposed to be there, navigating it with me. That is what wives do. They help their husbands. No, Emily corrected him, keeping her voice incredibly steady, refusing to match his volume. Wives partner with their husbands. They do not act as human shields. You were humiliated today because your father does not respect you, and your mother does not respect you. That has absolutely nothing to do with me. That is between you and them. I have spent 5 years letting them insult me just so they would not insult you. I am done doing that. Mark stared at her, breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his wrinkled dress shirt. He looked at her as if she were a complete stranger sitting in their living room. You are being completely selfish. He spat out the words laced with cold venom. You are punishing me because you are unhappy. I am not punishing you, Emily said, standing up from the sofa. She placed the folded blanket over the back of the chair. I am just giving you back your own family. You can manage them however you see fit. She walked past him, leaving him standing there alone in his frustration. The emotional distance between them widened into a massive, unbridgeable chasm. Mark had finally felt the sharp, uncomfortable sting of the true nature of his parents. But instead of standing up to them, he blamed Emily for stepping out of the line of fire. He wanted his shield back. He wanted his comfortable, quiet life back where she suffered silently, and he ate his roast beef in peace. But Emily knew as she walked up the wooden stairs that the old system was permanently broken. She was never going back to the slaughter. The bell above the heavy glass door chimed a soft welcoming note as Emily stepped out of the cold wind and into the warm air of the local cafe. The rich smell of roasted espresso beans and toasted butter pastries enveloped her immediately. It was Tuesday afternoon, a quiet, slow hour, where the frantic morning rush had finally faded into a sleepy, comfortable hum. She scanned the small room, spotting her best friend Clara. She was sitting in a worn brown leather booth right by the large front window. Clara was already waiting, holding a steaming ceramic mug tightly between her palms. Clara had been her anchor for over 12 years. They had met in their very first year of college, bonding over late-night study sessions, and shared pots of terrible dorm room coffee. Now, Clara worked as a paralegal at a prominent fast-paced family law firm downtown. She was incredibly sharp, deeply observant and fiercely protective of the people she loved. She saw the world clearly stripped of all its polite pretending layers. Emily slid into the booth across from her friend. She unravelled her thick knitted scarf, letting it fall onto the seat beside her. Clara looked up, her dark, intelligent eyes, scanning Emily's face with a practiced, clinical precision. You look different, Clara said, taking a slow, measured sip of her dark roast coffee. Not bad different, just lighter somehow, like you dropped something heavy on the sidewalk outside. Emily let out a long, shaky breath, resting her forearms on the scratched wooden table. I did not go to Sunday dinner, Emily said, stating the simple fact as if she had just confessed to a major crime. Clara raised an elegant eyebrow, setting her heavy mug down on the table. You skipped the royal court, Clara asked, a distinct hint of a proud smile playing on her lips. What did Mark do? He must have absolutely panicked. Emily stared at her own hands, tracing the faint swirling grain of the wood. He went alone, Emily replied, keeping her voice low. And he came back furious because they interrogated him for 3 hours. He blamed me for leaving him undefended. Clara leaned forward, resting her elbows heavily on the table. Good, Clara said, her voice firm and completely unwavering. It is about damn time he felt the intense heat of his own parents. You have been shielding that man for 5 entire years, Emily. 5 long years of letting Susan casually critique your clothes and your cooking and your career, 5 years of letting Richard treat you like a failing subordinate employee of the family business. Emily looked out the window, watching a yellow city bus roll slowly down the grey street. "It is worse now," Emily said, her voice dropping to a fragile, breaking whisper. "I went to the doctor 3 weeks ago, Clara. I finally got the test results back. I have polycystic ovary syndrome. That is exactly why we have not been able to get pregnant." The painful words hung heavily in the air, raw and exposed. Clara reached immediately across the table, covering Emily's trembling hand with her own warm palm. "Oh, sweetie," Clara murmured, her dark eyes softening with genuine, profound sorrow. "I am so incredibly sorry. That is a heavy thing to carry." "Does Mark know about this?" Emily nodded, fighting back a sudden hot wave of tears that pricked the corners of her eyes. "He knows," she said, swallowing the thick lump in her throat. "I told him the exact same day I found out. I cried in his arms on the sofa. And he still let his parents grill you about babies at every single dinner." Clara asked, her voice tightening with a sudden protective anger. "He let his mother send you those awful passive-aggressive diet articles, knowing your own body is fighting a medical battle against you." Emily looked down, ashamed of her husband's cowardice. "He did not tell them," Emily explained, defending him purely out of habit. "He said it was private, but really I know he was just terrified of his father's booming disappointment. If he tells them it is a medical issue, they will pry and they will judge, and he absolutely hates conflict. So he stays quiet and he lets them think I am just selfishly choosing to ruin their precious legacy." Clara squeezed Emily's hand, her sharp, paralegal mind instantly analysing the toxic dynamic. "He is a coward," Clara stated bluntly and honestly. "I see this exact thing all the time at the law firm, Em. Men who desperately want the comfort of a loving wife but completely refuse to do the hard work of being a real partner. They let their families tear their marriages apart because standing up to mommy and daddy requires a spine they do not have. You cannot build a solid life with a man who constantly hides behind your skirt." "I know," Emily whispered, feeling the profound, undeniable truth of Clara's words settle deep into her bones. "That is exactly why I stopped cooking the big dinners. That is why I stopped managing his social schedule. I realized sitting alone at the kitchen sink on Sunday night that he does not actually want a wife. He wants a human buffer, and I am simply too exhausted to be his buffer anymore." Clara leaned back against the worn leather seat, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are finally setting a boundary," Clara said, nodding slowly in deep approval. "And boundaries always feel like a massive betrayal to the people who are accustomed to using you. He is going to push back, Emily. He is going to throw a massive tantrum because the comfortable system is no longer serving him. You have to stay incredibly strong when the pressure mounts." "I do not even have the energy to fight him anymore," Emily admitted, signalling the friendly waitress for a cup of hot herbal tea. "I just feel incredibly numb to all of his panic. When he was yelling at me about his father's harsh lecture, I looked at him and I just felt deep pity. He is 36 years old, Clara, and he is still absolutely terrified of a man who still pays for his golf club membership. Just be very careful," Clara warned, stirring a small white packet of sugar into her dark coffee. "When men like Mark are forced to face their own failures, they rarely take any real responsibility. They look frantically for a convenient scapegoat. And right now, you are making yourself completely unavailable for the job. He is going to look for another way to blame you." The waitress brought a steaming white ceramic teapot, placing it gently on the table between them. Emily poured the pale yellow chamomile liquid, watching the hot steam curl into the cool cafe air. "I am not a scapegoat," Emily said, taking a slow, fortifying breath, feeling her own quiet power returning to her. "I am a person, and I am finally going to start acting like one." Clara smiled, a fierce, fiercely loyal expression that made Emily feel completely seen and completely safe. "I am right here with you," Clara promised, picking up her coffee mug. "Whatever happens next, you are not doing it alone." The crisp autumn air felt incredibly sharp against Emily's cheeks as she walked up the concrete driveway to her front door. It was Thursday afternoon, and the heavy metal mailbox was stuffed full of the daily delivery. She pulled out a stack of glossy grocery flyers and white utility bills, sorting through them with a numb, detached rhythm. Tucked neatly in the very centre of the mundane stack was a thick, cream-coloured envelope. The handwriting on the front was elegant looping and unmistakably Susan's. Emily stopped walking right in the middle of the paved walkway. A familiar, suffocating knot tightened in her chest, a reflex built over 5 long years of intercepting these little paper bombs. She carried the mail inside, dropping the bills onto the small entryway table. She took the cream envelope into the kitchen, slicing the top open with a silver butter knife. 3 glossy, full-colour brochures slid out, landing heavily on the granite counter. The bold purple letters screamed about advanced reproductive endocrinology and aggressive in vitro fertilization protocols at a luxury clinic downtown. Attached to the top brochure, with a small gold paperclip, was a handwritten note on Susan's personalized stationery. "Dearest Emily," the note read in that painfully polite cursive script. "I was speaking with a dear friend at the country club, and she highly recommended this specific doctor. I know these things can be delicate, but time is absolutely of the essence. We only want what is best for our family's future. Love, Susan." Emily stared at the dark blue ink, letting the words sink into the quiet, empty kitchen. Time is of the essence. Our family's future. The words were not a gentle suggestion. They were a polished, socially acceptable demand. In the past, Emily would have felt an immediate, crushing wave of total inadequacy. She would have taken the heavy, glossy brochures into the downstairs bathroom, locking the solid wood door so she could cry silently into a damp hand towel. She would have torn the thick paper into tiny, unrecognisable pieces, burying them deep in the bottom of the kitchen trash can, hiding the evidence under coffee grounds and vegetable peels. She would have done all of this before Mark ever walked through the front door, ensuring his evening remained perfectly pleasant and entirely conflict-free. She would have absorbed his mother's casual cruelty directly into her own bones, sparing him the uncomfortable reality. But today, Emily simply took a deep, steadying breath. She picked up the 3 glossy brochures, fanning them out perfectly, side by side, right in the centre of the large kitchen island. She placed Susan's handwritten note directly on top, making sure the blue ink was completely visible. It was the exact spot where Mark always dropped his leather briefcase and his heavy car keys. She did not cry. She did not hide them. She turned around, opened the stainless steel refrigerator, and began to chop vegetables for her own dinner, moving with a calm, deliberate focus. 2 hours later, the front door opened with a heavy, familiar click. Mark walked inside, loosening his striped tie, looking exhausted and slightly irritable. The lingering tension from his disastrous Sunday brunch still hung stubbornly between them like a thick fog. He walked into the kitchen, dropping his heavy leather briefcase onto the floor. He tossed his metal keys onto the granite island right next to the carefully arranged paper display. He froze his hand, hovering awkwardly in the air. He looked down at the bold purple letters and the gold paperclip. Emily kept her back to him, focusing intently on dicing a red bell pepper. She heard the distinct rustle of the thick paper as he picked up his mother's handwritten note. "What is this?" Mark asked, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable register. The mail arrived at 3 o'clock. Emily answered, keeping her tone light and completely conversational. She scraped the diced peppers into a hot, oiled pan. "Your mother sent them. She apparently thinks time is of the essence." Mark stood completely still, staring blankly at the invasive brochures. He looked terrified, like he was holding a live, ticking explosive in his bare hands. He waited for Emily to turn around. He waited for her to start crying so he could step in and play the comforting, supportive husband, smoothing over the conflict with vague, empty promises. He desperately needed her to have the emotional reaction so he did not have to feel it. But Emily did not turn around. She stirred the bright vegetables, the wooden spoon scraping rhythmically against the metal pan. "This is—" Mark stammered, his voice faltering in the quiet room. "This is really inappropriate, Em. I cannot believe she actually mailed these to our house." "I know," Emily agreed calmly, shaking a pinch of salt into the steaming food. "It is incredibly inappropriate." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between her calm back and the offensive papers on the counter. "Well," he said, his voice rising with desperate, anxious energy, "you should just throw them away. Do not even look at them, Emily. Just toss them out. It is none of her business." Emily turned off the hot stove, wiping her hands on a clean cotton towel. She finally turned around, leaning casually against the kitchen counter. She looked directly at her husband, seeing the sheer panic written all over his face. "I am not going to throw them away, Mark," Emily said quietly. "Why not?" Mark demanded, stepping back, as if the brochures were physically burning him. "They are upsetting you. Just get rid of them." "They are not upsetting me," Emily corrected him, her voice remarkably steady. "They are upsetting you, because they are sitting right there, forcing you to look at exactly how your mother treats your wife. I am not hiding them, Mark. If your mother wants to send aggressive medical advice to our home, you can be the one to look at it. You can be the one to deal with it." She walked past him, leaving the glossy papers untouched on the granite. Mark stared after her, his mouth slightly open, completely paralysed by the sudden heavy weight of his own reality. The invisible buffer was completely gone, and the cold truth of his family was staring him right in the face. The glossy brochures sat on the kitchen island for 3 entire days. Mark simply ignored them, sliding his car keys carefully around them every single evening. He pretended they did not exist, hoping the uncomfortable problem would just magically vanish. Emily left them right there, a silent, unmoving monument to his profound avoidance. The calendar page turned, bringing a crisp, exceptionally clear Friday morning. It was the 12th of November. It was their 6th wedding anniversary. For the past 5 years, Emily had meticulously managed this specific milestone. She treated their anniversary like a delicate, highly coordinated stage production. She would book a corner table at the upscale Italian restaurant downtown exactly 1 month in advance. She would buy him a thoughtful, expensive gift, wrapping it carefully in heavy silver paper. She would even go to the local florist, buying a dozen white roses using his shared credit card. She would arrange them in a crystal vase on the dining table so he would never have to feel the deep, embarrassing sting of his own forgetfulness. She had orchestrated his romance for him, ensuring he always looked like a perfectly attentive husband. This year, she did absolutely nothing. She did not leave a sweet handwritten card propped up against his bathroom mirror. She did not make a dinner reservation. She did not buy herself a bouquet of apology flowers. She woke up at 6 in the morning, listening to the steady, quiet rhythm of her own breathing. She felt a strange, detached curiosity, wondering how long it would actually take him to realize what day it was. Mark woke up at 7, rubbing his tired eyes, complaining loudly about the sudden drop in the autumn temperature. He put on his grey suit, tied his shoes, and drank a hurried cup of lukewarm coffee. He kissed the top of her head, completely distracted, and walked out the front door. He did not say happy anniversary. He did not even hesitate. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving Emily alone in the quiet morning light. The entire day passed in a slow, mundane blur. Emily went about her usual routine, running simple errands, organising the hall closet, reading a few chapters of her thick novel. She felt a persistent, quiet ache in her chest, but it was not a sharp, surprising pain. It was the dull, heavy ache of an expectation finally dropping away to reveal the cold, hard truth beneath it. She was entirely alone in this marriage. At 6:30 in the evening, the front door opened. Mark walked in carrying a large, greasy white paper bag from the local burger place down the street. The smell of fried potatoes and charred meat filled the narrow entryway. He dropped his heavy briefcase by the carpeted stairs, tossing his keys onto the granite counter right next to Susan's medical brochures. "I am completely exhausted," Mark announced, taking off his suit jacket, draping it casually over the back of a dining chair. "I grabbed some burgers on the way home. I figured we could just eat in front of the television tonight. It has been a brutal week at the office." "That sounds fine," Emily said, her voice perfectly mild, completely devoid of any sharp edge. She walked into the kitchen, pulling 2 simple white ceramic plates from the upper cabinet. She did not sigh. She did not slam the heavy cabinet doors. She simply plated the greasy food, carrying it into the living room, setting it down on the glass coffee table. They sat side by side on the large grey sofa, staring blankly at a loud, flashing action movie. Mark ate quickly, completely absorbed in the bright colours on the flat screen. Emily took small, slow bites of her food, watching the digital clock on the black cable box. It was 7:45. The evening was almost over. Suddenly, Mark's cell phone buzzed loudly, vibrating against the hard glass of the coffee table. The screen lit up in the dark room. Mark picked it up, unlocking the screen with his thumb. Emily watched him out of the corner of her eye. She saw his body go completely rigid. She saw the bright light from the phone screen reflect off his wide, suddenly terrified eyes. It was an automated calendar alert, or perhaps a sudden jarring text message from his mother, demanding to know how they were celebrating. The colour drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and slightly sick. He slowly lowered the black phone, turning his head to look at Emily. She was still eating a French fry, her eyes fixed calmly on the glowing television screen. "Emily, Mark," whispered, his voice cracking just a fraction. "Is today the 12th? "It is," Emily replied, not turning to look at him. "Oh my God," Mark breathed out, running both hands frantically through his dark hair. "Emily, I am so incredibly sorry. I completely forgot. I had back-to-back meetings all day long. My calendar was an absolute nightmare. Why did you not say anything this morning? Why would I say something?" Emily asked, finally, turning her head to meet his panicked gaze. "It is your anniversary too. You are a grown man. You have a calendar right there in your hand." Mark scrambled, jumping up from the soft sofa, his nervous energy filling the quiet room. "We can still go somewhere," he insisted, his voice rising in a desperate, pleading pitch. "I can call the Italian place. I can get us a table. Go put on a nice dress, Em. I will fix this. Let me fix this. I do not want to go anywhere," Emily said softly, picking up her paper napkin, wiping her fingers. "I am already in my sweatpants. I am eating a cold burger." "The day is over, Mark." His panic instantly twisted into deep defensive anger. He felt foolish, and he absolutely hated feeling foolish. "You did this on purpose," Mark accused, pointing a rigid finger in her direction. "You knew I was slammed at work. You always remind me about these things. You always book the nice restaurant. You just sat there all day long waiting for me to fail. You set a trap for me, Emily." "I did not set a trap," Emily said, her voice remaining quiet and completely steady. "I just stopped doing the work for you. I stopped managing your side of the relationship. And the very minute I stopped, the entire system completely collapsed." "You are acting crazy," Mark yelled, his frustration boiling over, echoing loudly against the painted living room walls. "You are punishing me for absolutely no reason. This is exactly what my father meant about you. You are trying to dictate how this family runs by playing these childish, manipulative games." Emily stood up, looking at her husband, standing defensively in the middle of their living room. He was actually blaming her for his own failure to remember their wedding day. He was using his father's toxic words as a weapon against her. "I am not dictating anything," Emily said, her voice ringing with a sad, profound clarity. "I am simply existing, Mark. And it is absolutely terrifying to you to realize how little you actually contribute to this shared life when I am not doing it all for you." She turned her back on him, leaving him standing there alone with his cold burger and his overwhelming inadequacy. The distance between them was no longer just emotional. It was a solid, unmoving wall built entirely of his own negligence. The grandfather clock in the dark hallway chimed 10 times. It was a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the silent house. Emily sat at the kitchen island nursing a lukewarm cup of herbal tea. The house was completely quiet. Mark had gone up to bed at 8 o'clock, claiming he had a terrible headache. He had barely spoken to her since the disastrous forgotten anniversary. The silence between them had thickened, turning from a temporary cold front into a permanent freezing winter. Emily traced the rim of her ceramic mug, feeling the smooth, glazed edge against her fingertip. She was not sad anymore. She was simply profoundly awake. Suddenly, the bright glare of car headlights swept across the dark living room window. The beams cut through the shadows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Emily frowned, setting her tea down on the granite counter. She walked slowly to the heavy front door, peering through the small glass side panel. A familiar dark sedan was parked haphazardly in the driveway. The engine was already off. The driver's side door opened, and Clara stepped out into the cold November night. Clara was wearing a yellow dark wool coat, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She did not walk with her usual confident stride. Her steps were hurried and incredibly tense. Tucked tightly under her right arm was a thick brown manila envelope. Emily unlocked the deadbolt, pulling the heavy door open just as Clara reached the top step. The cold wind rushed into the warm foyer, bringing the sharp smell of dry leaves and impending frost. "Clara," Emily whispered, her voice laced with immediate concern. "It is past 10 o'clock. Is everything all right? Are you hurt?" Clara stepped inside, brushing past Emily without a single word of greeting. She walked straight into the brightly lit kitchen, dropping her heavy leather purse onto a dining chair. She stood by the kitchen island, her chest rising and falling with deep, shaky breaths. She looked at Emily, and her dark, intelligent eyes were filled with a strange, terrifying mixture of profound sorrow and absolute rage. "Lock the door," Clara instructed, her voice completely flat, completely drained of its usual warmth, "and come sit down." Emily felt a cold prickle of raw adrenaline wash over her skin. She closed the heavy front door, turning the brass lock with a loud final click. She walked back into the kitchen, pulling out a wooden stool sitting directly across from her best friend. Clara placed the thick brown manila envelope flat on the granite counter right between them. It looked incredibly heavy, sitting there, in the bright overhead light. "What is going on?" Emily asked, her hands instinctively folding tightly in her lap. "You are scaring me, Clara." Clara let out a long, ragged sigh, leaning her weight onto the hard counter. "I need you to listen to me." Clara started, her tone carefully measured, like she was speaking to a fragile witness on a courtroom stand. "I need you to stay incredibly calm, and I need you to understand that I did not go looking for this to hurt you. I went looking to protect you. Protect me from what Emily asked, her heart beginning to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. 2 days ago, Clara explained, keeping her eyes locked securely on Emily. "You asked me to help you organize your insurance records. You wanted to build a solid file to appeal the coverage denial for your new fertility treatments. You gave me your shared login credentials for the major insurance portal. You asked me to download the entire history for the last 5 years. Emily nodded, swallowing the dry lump in her throat. Yes, she confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. I needed the billing codes. The clinic said they needed proof of prior diagnostic tests. I pulled the files, Clara continued, her voice dropping to a quiet, devastating murmur. And because it is a joint spousal policy, I saw Mark's history too. I was not trying to pry, Em. I was just sorting the digital pages, separating your laboratory codes from his routine dental visits. But my paralegal brain is trained to look for anomalies. It is my entire job to spot the things that do not belong. Clara reached out, resting her hand firmly on top of the brown envelope. She tapped her index finger against the thick paper, a slow, deliberate beat. I found a billing code. Clara said the words, hanging heavily in the tense air. An outpatient surgical code from 4 years ago. It was dated exactly 6 months before the two of you ever met. It was billed to a private specialty clinic up in Evanston. Emily stared at the brown envelope. Her mind erased, trying to make sense of the fragmented information. A surgery, Emily repeated, feeling completely lost. Mark never had surgery. He had his wisdom teeth pulled in college, but that is it. He never mentioned a private clinic. He never mentioned a hospital stay. He did not stay overnight, Clara corrected her, her voice laced with a sudden sharp bitterness. It was an elective outpatient procedure. It takes less than an hour to complete. And it is entirely permanent. Emily felt the cold, hard granite pressing against her forearms. The kitchen suddenly felt entirely too small, the bright lights entirely too blinding. She looked at Clara's face, searching for a punchline, searching for a mistake in the complicated legal paperwork. But Clara did not look away. She looked like a soldier delivering a casualty notice to a grieving family. I pulled the thread, Clara said, her voice steady and deeply protective. I used a favour with a friend of mine at the medical records office in Evanston. I had them verify the specific surgical code against the attending physician. I needed to be absolutely sure before I drove over here, in the middle of the night. I needed undeniable concrete proof. Clara slowly slid the brown manila envelope across the smooth granite, stopping right in front of Emily's folded hands. I need you to be incredibly brave right now, Clara whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I need you to open this envelope, Emily. I need you to read exactly what your husband has been hiding from you for your entire marriage. Emily looked down at the rough brown paper. Her hands were shaking violently, a sudden uncontrollable tremor rattling through her bones. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the edge of the thick envelope. The grandfather clock in the dark hallway ticked a slow, methodical rhythm, counting down the very last seconds of her old life. Emily's fingers felt entirely numb as she pulled the metal clasp of the brown envelope open. The sound of the thick paper tearing slightly echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. She reached inside, pulling out a single stapled stack of white medical documents. The paper felt heavy and incredibly cold against her skin. She laid the papers flat on the granite counter, right under the bright overhead light. The letterhead at the very top of the first page belonged to a urology clinic up in Evanston. It was a crisp, professional logo printed in dark blue ink. Emily scanned down to the patient information box. She saw the typed letters spelling out her husband's name, his date of birth and his old apartment address from before they were married. She moved her eyes further down the page to the section marked Primary Procedure. The medical terminology was printed clearly in stark black letters. Elective bilateral vasectomy. Emily stopped breathing. The air in her lungs turned instantly to solid ice. She stared at the 3 words, reading them over and over again, hoping the letters would magically rearrange themselves into something else. but they did not change. They sat there, a permanent, undeniable fact, staring right back at her. She looked up from the paper, her eyes meeting Clara's. Clara was watching her with an expression of profound, aching grief, her own eyes bright with tears. "What is this?" Emily asked, her voice sounding incredibly small, like it belonged to a frightened child. "It is a permanent sterilization procedure," Clara answered, her voice trembling just a fraction. "He had it done 4 years ago, Emily. Almost a full year before he ever met you at that birthday party." Emily looked back down at the white paper. The date of the surgery was stamped clearly right next to the doctor's signature. It was an elective choice, a completely private, permanent decision he had made for his own body long before she ever entered his life. But he never told me, Emily whispered, the profound horror beginning to slowly seep into her bones. When we were dating, he said he wanted a family. When we got engaged, he talked about adding a nursery to the house. He lied, Clara said, stating the brutal, necessary truth without looking away. He lied to you to get you to marry him, and then he kept lying. A sudden, violent wave of nausea rolled through Emily's stomach. She gripped the edge of the granite counter, her knuckles turning completely white. The memories of the last 5 years came rushing back, hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She remembered sitting in the sterile office of her own doctor, crying uncontrollably when she received her diagnosis. She remembered the deep, crushing shame of feeling like a broken, defective woman. She remembered driving home, her hands shaking on the steering wheel, absolutely terrified that Mark would leave her because she could not easily give him a child. She remembered walking through the front door and collapsing into his arms, sobbing into his shirt. She remembered his warm hands stroking her hair. She remembered his soothing voice telling her it was going to be all right, telling her they would figure it out together. He knew Emily gasped, the realization hitting her so hard she felt dizzy. He held me while I cried over my failing body, and he knew the entire time that he was the one who made it impossible. Clara nodded slowly, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. "He let you take the blame," Clara whispered. The nausea faded, replaced instantly by a cold, terrifying clarity. The puzzle pieces of her entire marriage violently snapped into their proper places. Mark was terrified of his father's booming demands for a legacy. He was terrified of his mother's icy judgment. He had made a permanent decision to never have children, but he was far too much of a coward to ever admit it to his own parents. So he found a woman Emily realized, her voice turning hard and incredibly sharp. He found me, and he let his parents blame me. He let his mother send me fertility brochures. He let his father humiliate me at the dinner table. He sat right next to me, eating his food while they tore me apart piece by piece, because as long as they were angry at me, they were not looking at him. He used you as a shield, Clara agreed, her voice thick with protective rage. He sacrificed your mental health and your dignity just to protect his own secret. He is a coward, Emily. He is the worst kind of coward. Emily looked at the medical document one last time. The typed letters no longer looked like a medical record. They looked like a confession. They looked like the death certificate of her entire marriage. She did not feel the urge to scream or to throw plates against the kitchen wall. The betrayal was far too deep for a simple tantrum. It was a foundational earthquake, destroying every single thing she thought she knew about the man sleeping upstairs. "I spent 5 years," Emily said, her voice dropping to an eerie, unnatural calm. "I spent 5 years trying to fix a body that was not the problem. I let them treat me like a defective appliance." "You are not defective," Clara said fiercely, reaching across the cold granite gripping Emily's wrists. "You are perfectly fine. He is the one who is broken." Emily pulled her hands away slowly, deliberately. She carefully folded the white medical document, sliding it back into the brown manila envelope. She folded the metal clasp perfectly flat. She was done crying. She was done being the victim of the toxic, inherited demands of the family upstairs. "What do I do now?" Emily asked, looking at her best friend, feeling the heavy, cold armour of absolute resolve settling over her shoulders. "We get you out," Clara said, her paralegal mind instantly shifting into tactical mode. "We make a plan, Emily, and we take back every single piece of your life." Emily nodded once, a sharp, definitive movement. She turned her head, looking toward the dark hallway, toward the carpeted stairs where her husband slept, completely unaware that his perfect, cowardly system had just been burned entirely to the ground. Let him sleep. Emily thought her heart beating a slow, powerful rhythm. The rude awakening was finally coming. The next 3 days moved in a hazy, disconnected blur. Emily walked through her own house like a quiet ghost haunting the edges of her husband's perfectly curated life. Mark remained completely oblivious to the massive storm brewing right beneath his feet. He went to his corporate office, he ate the simple dinners she prepared, and he watched television perfectly content in his cowardly silence. But inside Emily, something profound was physically shifting. She felt a strange, persistent exhaustion settling deep into her heavy bones. At first, she thought it was just the sheer trauma of the devastating betrayal weighing her down. She could barely eat the smell of her morning coffee, making her stomach churn violently. She stood over the stainless steel kitchen sink on a cold Tuesday morning, gripping the smooth edge, waiting for a sudden, intense wave of dizziness to finally pass. A strange metallic taste lingered stubbornly on her tongue. Her monthly cycle was always incredibly irregular, a cruel, predictable symptom of her medical diagnosis. But this feeling was profoundly, undeniably different. Her breasts ached with a heavy, unfamiliar tenderness. She felt a strange, fluttering heat low in her abdomen. Her body, which she had viewed as a failing, defective machine for 5 long years, was suddenly demanding her absolute attention. She walked to the living room, picking up her cell phone. She called the one person who would not ask a million exhausting questions. Her mother Helen lived just an hour down the highway in a quiet suburb. Helen was a deeply practical woman who showed her fierce love through immediate, tangible action. When Emily softly explained that she felt incredibly sick and needed to see a doctor, Helen did not hesitate. "I'm leaving right now," Helen said, her voice a steady, comforting anchor through the small speaker. "Drink a glass of water and sit down. I will be there in exactly 60 minutes. Helen arrived, pulling her practical blue sedan right into the driveway. She took one single look at her daughter's incredibly pale face and gently took Emily's heavy winter coat from the closet. They drove to the medical clinic in absolute comfortable silence. It was the exact same clinic where Dr. Evans had handed Emily her crushing diagnosis just a few short weeks ago. The sterile smell of rubbing alcohol and clean linen hit Emily the moment they walked through the sliding glass doors. Emily sat nervously on the crinkling paper-covered examination table. Her mother sat in the corner plastic chair, holding Emily's dark wool coat securely across her lap. The waiting felt entirely agonizing. Finally, the wooden door opened, and Dr. Evans walked in, holding a digital tablet, looking slightly perplexed behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "We ran the complete blood panel," Dr. Evans said, tapping the glowing screen with a plastic pen. "You mentioned extreme fatigue and severe morning nausea, Emily. I wanted to rule out any sudden severe hormonal imbalances caused by your underlying condition." Emily nodded, her hands folded so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. "I just feel incredibly sick," Emily explained, keeping her voice low. "I know the condition makes everything entirely unpredictable." Dr. Evans pulled up a small metal stool, sitting down right in front of Emily. She looked at her patient with a gentle, completely stunned expression. "The condition is unpredictable," the doctor agreed, leaning forward slightly. "But your blood work is actually very clear. You are not experiencing a hormonal crash, Emily. You are pregnant, The small, brightly lit examination room went completely deathly silent. Helen stopped breathing, her hands gripping the thick fabric of the winter coat. Emily stared at the doctor, her mind completely refusing to process the impossible, staggering words. "That is absolutely impossible," Emily whispered, shaking her head slowly from side to side. "My husband had a permanent sterilization procedure 4 years ago. We literally cannot have children. It is medically impossible." Dr. Evans sighed gently, offering a soft, deeply sympathetic smile. "It is highly improbable," the doctor corrected her, placing the digital tablet onto the flat counter. "But it is not strictly impossible. The specific procedure he had done carries a natural failure rate of less than 1%. Sometimes over the course of several years, the human body simply heals itself. The pathways can spontaneously reconnect without any warning." Emily felt the room spinning violently, entirely out of control. 1%. A microscopic, almost non-existent chance. After 5 agonizing years of taking the absolute blame for a barren home. After letting his cruel family tear her completely apart. After discovering his massive, unforgivable lie hidden in a brown paper envelope. The universe had decided to execute the most profound, devastating miracle on all of them. "We need to do an ultrasound," Dr. Evans said softly, standing up from the metal stool. "Just to be absolutely sure of the gestation timeline and the viability." Helen stood up immediately, walking to the edge of the examination table. She took Emily's trembling hand, holding it fiercely between her own warm palms. Emily lay back against the crinkling white paper, staring blankly at the bright ceiling tiles. The cold, clear gel hit her bare stomach, making her flinch just a fraction. The doctor moved the small plastic wand across Emily's lower abdomen, staring intently at the dark square monitor. The silence stretched for what felt like an entire lifetime. And then a sound filled the quiet, clinical room. It was a rapid, rhythmic swoosh, beating loudly like a tiny, frantic drum. "There it is," Dr. Evans whispered, turning the heavy screen so Emily could see. "Right there. You are exactly 8 weeks along. It is a very strong, very healthy heartbeat." Emily looked at the blurry, grey monitor, seeing the tiny, flickering pulse of pure light. The sheer magnitude of the impossible situation crashed over her like a massive tidal wave. She was carrying a child. Her child. The very child that Richard and Susan had aggressively demanded. The exact child that Mark had secretly, permanently tried to prevent. The child that simply decided to exist anyway, defying every single odd and every single medical textbook. Hot, heavy tears spilled over her cheeks, running fast into her hair. Helen leaned down, pressing her forehead against Emily's trembling shoulder, crying silently right alongside her daughter. It was not a simple moment of pure, unadulterated joy. It was a moment of massive, terrifying complication. The tiny heartbeat echoing in the small room changed absolutely everything. It completely destroyed the simple narrative of her quiet exit, tying her permanently to the family she was about to destroy. Helen drove the practical blue sedan back toward the quiet suburbs, keeping both hands firmly on the steering wheel. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the busy highway. Emily sat in the passenger seat, holding the small, glossy sonogram photograph completely still in her lap. She stared down at the tiny grey blur, listening to the rhythmic hum of the car tyres against the pavement. The profound, staggering irony of her situation felt incredibly heavy, settling deep into her chest. She had spent 5 long years believing her own body was entirely broken. She had swallowed every single bitter insult from Richard and Susan, accepting the blame for a barren family tree. And now she was holding the undeniable photographic proof of a medical miracle, the 1% failure rate Dr. Evans had called it, a microscopic, almost invisible chance. Mark had undergone a permanent surgical procedure, specifically to ensure he would never have to be a father. He had lied to her face, keeping his cowardice locked away in a brown envelope while she cried over her own perceived failures. But the universe had a completely different, entirely ruthless plan. The procedure had failed, reversing itself quietly in the dark. Life had forced its way right through his perfectly constructed, cowardly walls. Helen parked the car in the concrete driveway, turning off the engine. She looked over at her pale daughter, offering a gentle, reassuring smile. "We are going to figure this out," Helen said softly, unbuckling her seatbelt. "You are not alone in this, Emily. You have me, and you have Clara. We will build a fortress right around this baby." Emily nodded, feeling a sudden fierce rush of protective maternal instinct rising hot in her blood. She slipped the glossy sonogram carefully into her purse. They walked into the quiet, empty house. Mark was still downtown, sitting in his corporate office, completely unaware that his entire world had just been permanently altered. Helen immediately went to the kitchen, filling the kettle with water, to make a strong pot of herbal tea. Emily walked into the living room, sitting heavily on the grey sofa. An hour later, the front doorbell rang. Clara walked through the door wearing her sharp legal suit, looking instantly concerned. She took one look at Helen sitting in the kitchen and walked straight over to Emily. "Tell me what happened," Clara demanded gently, sitting on the edge of the coffee table. Emily did not say a single word. She simply reached into her leather purse, pulling out the small square photograph. She handed it to her best friend. Clara looked down at the image, her sharp, intelligent eyes widening in absolute shock. The paralegal mind processed the impossible information in a matter of seconds. Clara looked up, her mouth falling open. "Is this?" Clara started, her voice completely failing her. "Is this real, Emily?" "It is real." Emily confirmed, a small, incredibly sad smile touching her lips. "I am exactly 8 weeks along. The doctor said his procedure had a very rare, natural failure rate. He tried to permanently stop it, Clara, but it happened anyway." Clara let out a loud, breathless laugh, shaking her head in total disbelief. "It is the absolute most poetic justice I have ever seen," Clara whispered, handing the photograph back. "He built a fortress of lies to protect himself from his father, and his own biology just burned it to the ground. What are you going to do? Are you going to tell him tonight?" Emily looked down at the grey blur of her tiny child. She thought about Mark walking through the front door, complaining about his long commute. If she told him tonight in the quiet privacy of their home, he would panic. He would desperately try to manage the narrative. He would find a way to twist the absolute miracle into a victory for himself, hiding his initial betrayal from his demanding parents. He would never, ever face the true consequences of what he had done to her. "I am not telling him tonight," Emily said, her voice turning incredibly hard and entirely resolute. "I am not giving him the chance to manipulate this behind closed doors." Helen walked into the living room carrying a tray of hot tea. She set it down, looking proudly at her strong daughter. "When are you going to do it?" Helen asked, pouring the steaming liquid into 3 ceramic cups. "Next Thursday," Emily stated, looking directly into Clara's eyes. "Richard and Susan are hosting their massive Thanksgiving dinner at the private country club. They rented the entire dining room. They invited all the cousins, all the business partners, everyone. They expect me to show up, wear a nice dress and sit quietly while Richard gives another booming toast about family legacy." Clara slowly smiled, a fierce, protective glint shining in her dark eyes. "You are going to drop the bomb right in the middle of the turkey?" Clara asked, leaning forward with intense interest. "No," Emily corrected her, picking up her warm teacup. "I am going to let Mark sit at that long table. I am going to let him listen to his father's toxic expectations. I am going to wait until the very last moment. And then I am going to lay the medical records and this sonogram right on the white tablecloth in front of everyone he fears. He used me as a shield for 5 years. Next Thursday, I am dropping the shield entirely." Clara raised her teacup, holding it steady in the air. "I am coming to that dinner," Clara announced. "I am dating Mark's cousin anyway. I will be sitting right there, holding the envelope until you are absolutely ready." Helen picked up her own cup, nodding in firm agreement. "We are doing this properly," Helen said. "We are ending this chapter on your exact terms, Emily." Emily took a slow, deep breath, tasting the warm chamomile. The profound terror of the morning had completely vanished. She felt grounded, standing firmly on a foundation she was finally building for herself. The grand Thanksgiving dinner was exactly 9 days away. She just had to play the part of the quiet, failing wife for 9 more days. And then she would burn the entire facade straight to the ground. The heavy glass doors of the private country club swung open, letting a rush of cold air into the warm lobby. The air inside smelled of expensive floor wax and roasted sage. Emily handed her long wool coat to the young attendant, taking a small numbered ticket in return. She wore a simple dark navy dress and her grandmother's pearl earrings. It was the exact dress Susan had once called a little too sombre for a festive holiday. Tonight, however, it felt like the absolute perfect armour. Mark stood 2 feet away from her, adjusting his dark silk tie, completely refusing to meet her eyes. He had been incredibly quiet for the entire 40 minutes of drive. He had been moving like a frightened shadow for the last 9 days, avoiding her completely in their own home. They walked slowly down the long, heavily carpeted hallway toward the private dining room. The loud sound of clinking crystal glasses and booming laughter echoed off the dark mahogany walls. Richard and Susan had reserved the absolute largest space the club had to offer. There were 22 people mingling casually around the massive stone fireplace. Cousins, business partners, and wealthy family friends, all holding tall champagne flutes. Emily felt a sudden, familiar tightness grip her chest, but she simply took a deep, fortifying breath. She was no longer the frightened woman who cried in her car over a medical diagnosis. She was entirely awake, and she was entirely prepared. Susan immediately spotted them from across the crowded, elegant room. She glided over wearing a tailored champagne-coloured blazer. She did not offer Emily a warm embrace. She barely offered a polite, socially acceptable smile. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mark," Susan said, kissing her son lightly on both cheeks. She turned to Emily, her sharp eyes performing their usual, highly critical sweep. "You look very comfortable, Emily." Susan noted her voice perfectly smooth, expertly masking the subtle, familiar insult. "Come inside quickly. Richard is very eager to sit down. We have a lot to discuss this year." Mark nodded stiffly, grabbing a glass of dark amber bourbon from a passing waiter. He took a long, desperate swallow, the ice clinking loudly against the glass. He looked frantically around the crowded room, desperately searching for anyone else to talk to. "I am going to say hello to Uncle David," Mark muttered, walking quickly away before Emily could even respond. He left her standing there completely alone under the bright, glowing crystal chandelier. It was his signature move, abandoning her to manage his intimidating mother entirely by herself. But tonight Emily did not try to frantically fill the awkward silence. She did not offer a compliment on Susan's expensive blazer. She simply looked at her mother-in-law and smiled a cold, completely flat smile. "I think I will find my seat," Emily said quietly, walking away, leaving Susan momentarily speechless. Emily moved gracefully toward the long, impeccably set dining table. Crisp white linen, heavy silver flatware, and towering autumn floral arrangements dominated the centre of the space. She walked the length of the table searching for her small calligraphed place card. She was seated near the head of the table directly next to Mark, and 3 chairs down from Richard. She looked across the beautiful table. Just a few seats away, Clara was already sitting. Clara was wearing a sharp, dark dress, chatting politely with Mark's younger cousin. Clara casually looked up, her dark, intelligent eyes locking directly onto Emily. The bustling noise of the room seemed to completely fade away for a single defining second. Clara gave a small, microscopic nod, resting her hand gently on her black leather purse. The thick brown envelope was safely tucked inside. The loud, sharp ringing of a silver spoon against a crystal glass brought the entire room to a sudden halt. Richard stood proudly at the head of the massive table, his chest puffed out with extreme self-importance. "Take your seats, everyone!" Richard boomed, his voice echoing with practiced corporate authority. The guests moved quickly to their chairs, the heavy wood scraping against the thick patterned carpet. Mark slid into the chair right next to Emily. He smelled of strong bourbon and a sharp, nervous sweat. He stared down at his empty white plate, his jaw clenched incredibly tight. He did not say a word to her. He did not pull out her chair. He looked physically ill, staring blankly at the silver fork, as if he expected it to suddenly burst into flames. He knew his father was preparing to speak, and his terror was radiating off his skin in waves. Emily folded her heavy cloth napkin, placing it gently across her lap. Her own powerful secret rested safely in her dark navy purse, tucked right beneath her chair. The glossy sonogram and the certified medical records felt like a silent ticking clock counting down the minutes to absolute destruction. The first 2 courses passed in a tense, suffocating blur. Waiters in dark vests poured expensive wine and served plates of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes. The cousins argued loudly about the recent football season. Susan constantly signalled the staff to refill the water glasses, completely ignoring Emily. Mark ate absolutely nothing. He just drank his wine, gripping the delicate stem of the glass so hard his knuckles turned white. Emily took small, careful bites of her green beans. She looked around the long table at the 22 familiar faces, completely unaware of the massive storm gathering right above their heads. She looked at Richard, chewing his food, projecting total patriarchal control. And she looked at Mark, shrinking silently into his expensive grey suit, choosing cowardice over his marriage for the very last time. The gathering storm was completely invisible to them, but Emily could feel the lightning crackling in her veins. Let the dinner continue. Emily thought her heart beating a slow, incredibly powerful rhythm. The waiters moved silently around the large mahogany table, their movements perfectly synchronized and completely invisible. They cleared the heavy white plates, taking away the half-eaten turkey, the untouched green beans and the cold sweet potatoes. The room was filled with the soft clinking of expensive china and heavy silver flatware scraping against the serving trays. Emily sat perfectly still, watching the efficient, practiced movements of the professional waitstaff. The heavy, suffocating feeling in the room began to shift in a very distinct way. It was no longer just the passive, aggressive tension of a normal holiday gathering. It was a sharp, focused energy building rapidly at the head of the table. The air felt incredibly thin, as if a massive storm was pulling all the oxygen straight out of the room. Richard cleared his throat, a loud scraping sound that commanded immediate absolute attention. He reached for his crystal wine glass, holding it firmly by the delicate, glittering stem. He picked up his silver dessert spoon, tapping the side of the glass 3 distinct ringing times. The sharp sound cut violently through the low hum of the family conversation. The cousins stopped arguing about the recent football game mid-sentence. The business partners turned their heavy wooden chairs to face the head of the table. The entire room fell entirely silent, waiting obediently for the patriarch to speak. It was a conditioned response, built over decades of complete, unquestioning submission. Richard stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored dark wool suit jacket. He looked incredibly proud, surveying the long table like a king inspecting his loyal subjects. He let the silence hang in the air for a long, dramatic moment, ensuring every single eye was securely fastened on him. "I want to say a few words," Richard began, his booming voice easily filling the large wood-panelled room. He sounded heavily rehearsed and incredibly formal, like a corporate executive delivering a crucial quarterly report to a board of directors. "I want to talk about family. I want to talk about what it means to actually build something that lasts through the ages." Emily kept her eyes locked securely on his flushed, arrogant face. She did not look down at her empty placemat. She did not look over at her terrified husband. She let Richard look right at her completely, refusing to blink, refusing to offer him the frightened submission he so desperately craved. For 4 generations, Richard continued pacing slowly, behind his heavy wooden chair, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. This family has understood the profound importance of responsibility. We do not just inherit a name or a successful business portfolio. We inherit a sacred duty to the people who came before us and the people who will come after us. A duty to grow and to provide and to leave this world significantly stronger than we found it. Susan nodded in solemn theatrical agreement, sitting at the opposite end of the long table. She folded her hands neatly on the crisp white tablecloth, her face a perfect polished mask of supportive grace. She was playing her part exactly as it was written, the loyal matriarch, validating the harsh, necessary wisdom of her husband. Mark shifted violently in the heavy chair right next to Emily. His knee began to bounce an erratic, frantic rhythm, hitting the underside of the thick wooden table. He reached for his crystal water glass, but his hand was shaking so severely he had to put it right back down before the water spilled. He was completely trapped, caught exactly in the middle between his father's booming public expectations and his own massive, cowardly lie. He stared down at the white linen, looking physically sick, his breathing shallow and incredibly fast. "But building a legacy," Richard said, his voice dropping to a serious, incredibly heavy register. "It requires much more than just hard work and financial intelligence. It requires absolute honesty. And sometimes it requires us to make incredibly difficult decisions. Not because we want to, but because we absolutely have to. Because true love for the foundation we have built demands that we completely correct our course when things are no longer working as they should." Emily heard the word honesty echo off the dark wooden walls. She felt a sudden profound urge to laugh out loud. The sheer staggering hypocrisy of the statement was almost entirely blinding. This entire family was built securely on a foundation of absolute silence and carefully managed secrets. They demanded complete, unquestioning perfection while hiding their own massive flaws behind expensive suits and heavy wooden doors. She thought about the glossy sonogram resting quietly inside her dark navy purse. She thought about the stark white medical document confirming Mark's permanent surgical lie. Honesty was the very last thing this family actually wanted. They only wanted total compliance. Richard stopped pacing. He stood squarely at the head of the long table. His eyes moved slowly down the long row of seated silent guests. He looked at the younger cousins, he looked at Clara, and finally his intense gaze landed directly on Emily. He did not look away. He held her eyes for one painful beat and then 2, letting the heavy unspoken implication settle violently over the entire room. We cannot simply ignore the truth. Richard stated, his voice ringing with absolute unwavering certainty. When a partnership is failing to produce the necessary results, we have a profound moral obligation to step in. We have an obligation to protect the future of this family at all costs. The table was entirely silent. It was not a comfortable, relaxed quiet. It was the deeply uncomfortable, suffocating quiet of a room that already knew exactly what was coming. The wealthy business partners stared down at their laps, pretending not to notice the public execution. The cousins exchanged nervous, darting glances, completely afraid to speak. Susan looked directly at Emily, a small, completely triumphant smile playing at the very corners of her painted mouth. Emily turned her head very slowly to look at Mark. He was staring intensely at his empty hands. His face was completely flushed, covered in a thin, undeniable sheen of nervous sweat. He knew exactly what his father was preparing to do. He had known this entire time. He had sat in the passenger seat and ridden to this dinner, knowing perfectly well she was walking straight into a calculated ambush. Richard reached down his arm, disappearing beneath his heavy wooden chair. The loud sound of rustling paper echoed sharply in the completely silent room. He pulled up a thick manila folder, holding it flat in his large hands. He placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth. The folder looked incredibly stark and out of place, sitting right next to the crystal goblets and the silver gravy boats. The gathering storm was no longer invisible. It was sitting right there on the table. Richard placed his large hand flat on top of the manila folder. He looked directly down the long table, his eyes locking onto Emily with cold corporate precision. He did not say her name. He simply pushed the thick paper across the polished wood and the crisp white linen. The folder slid smoothly, passing the silver gravy boats and the tall crystal water pitchers. It stopped exactly in front of Emily's empty plate. Mark and Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly in the completely silent room. "We have discussed this situation at great length. We have looked at all the angles and we have determined that this is the absolute best path forward for everyone involved." Emily stared at the brown folder. The room was so quiet she could actually hear the soft humming of the central heating unit vibrating in the walls. It was not a silence of sudden shock. It was a heavy, complicit silence. It was the absolute quiet of 22 people who already knew exactly what was inside that folder. They had all sat down to eat their roasted turkey and their sweet potatoes, knowing perfectly well that the main course was the public execution of her marriage. She turned her head very slowly to look at the man sitting right next to her. Mark was gripping his crystal wine glass so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He was staring intensely at the dark red liquid, completely refusing to turn his head an inch. He had known, Emily realized, feeling a cold, profound numbness wash over her skin. He had sat on the edge of their bed, putting on his dark silk tie. He had driven the car down the busy highway. He had walked into this elegant room, knowing his father was going to hand her separation papers right in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. Mark, Emily said softly, her voice carrying easily in the dead air. He did not move. He did not blink. He just swallowed hard, his throat bobbing in absolute terror. He was not a 36-year-old husband protecting his partner. He was a frightened little boy, completely paralyzed by the booming voice of his wealthy father. He had traded her dignity and her entire life just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation in his father's private study. "This is the right thing," Richard continued, entirely ignoring Emily's soft plea. "The terms inside are more than generous, Emily. We are prepared to offer a very fair settlement covering the next 6 months of your living expenses. We simply want to make this transition as smooth and efficient as possible so Mark can finally focus on building his proper future." Susan nodded gently, taking a small, elegant sip of her white wine. "It is for the best, Emily." Susan added, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "You have always struggled to fit into our dynamic. This will allow you to find a life that is much better suited to your natural capabilities." The sheer audacity of the coordinated attack was almost breathtaking. They were firing her from the family with a severance package, exactly like a failing corporate employee. They believed they held all the power in the room. They believed she would cry or scream or run sobbing into the cold autumn night, entirely humiliated. Emily looked across the wide table. She found Clara's dark, intelligent eyes. Clara was sitting perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on her black leather purse. Clara did not look panicked. She looked like a predator, waiting patiently in the tall grass. The small, microscopic nod Clara gave her was all the anchor Emily needed to stay firmly in her seat. She did not run. She did not cry. She reached out her fingers, brushing the rough paper of the manila folder. It felt incredibly heavy, filled with legal demands and permanent threats. She pulled it closer, resting it squarely over her crisp white cloth napkin. "You expect me to open this right now?" Emily asked, directing her question entirely to Richard. "I expect you to review the terms," Richard answered, crossing his arms over his chest. "And I expect you to sign the back page. I have a pen right here in my pocket. We can conclude this unfortunate business tonight and move forward with a clean slate." Emily let her hands rest flat on top of the folder. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 5 years lifting entirely off her shoulders. She was no longer trying to please these terrible people. She was no longer carrying the massive burden of Mark's cowardly secrets. The intense fear that had driven her entire marriage was completely gone, replaced by a cold, magnificent clarity. She was standing at the absolute edge of a massive cliff, and she was finally ready to jump. Emily opened the heavy manila folder, flipping the thick paper cover completely back. She did not reach for her purse to grab a tissue. She did not cover her face in sudden, overwhelming shame. She simply looked down at the crisp white legal documents resting quietly on the tablecloth. The first page was entirely covered in dense black text. It was a formal petition for the absolute dissolution of marriage. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored dark suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen, placing it directly on the table with a sharp, metallic click. "Just sign the final page," Richard instructed, his voice tight with rising authoritative impatience. "There is absolutely no need to drag this out, Emily. The lawyers have already reviewed everything." Emily did not pick up the gold pen. She ignored it completely. She kept her eyes locked securely on the first page of the legal document. She began to read. She read every single line of the densely typed text, taking her time with every single word. She read the formal legal language, outlining the division of their shared assets. She read about the proposed timeline for vacating their suburban home. She read about the 6 months of financial support offered like a generous prize for her quiet, obedient departure. The silence in the dining room stretched out, becoming incredibly heavy and deeply uncomfortable. Richard was accustomed to immediate, unquestioning obedience. He expected her to cry loudly, to sign the paper blindly, and to run away, hiding her face in absolute disgrace. He did not expect her to sit at the head of the table holding the entire room hostage with her slow, deliberate reading. A full minute passed, ticking by in agonizingly slow motion. Down the long hall, Emily could faintly hear the muffled sound of the coat check radio playing a soft jazz tune. Someone further down the table coughed nervously, shifting their weight in the heavy wooden chair. The sound of a metal fork dropping accidentally onto a fine china plate rang out like a sudden gunshot. Emily did not rush. She finished the first page, turning it over with a soft rustling sound. She began reading the second page. Susan let out a sharp, dramatic sigh of profound irritation. "Emily," Susan said, her voice laced with cold, practiced condescension, "you are being completely unreasonable. You cannot possibly understand all of that complicated legal jargon. Just sign the document and we can all move on with our holiday evening." Emily did not look up from the crisp white paper. She simply raised her left hand, lifting a single steady index finger right into the air. It was a universal, undeniable gesture demanding absolute silence. Susan gasped softly, completely shocked by the sudden brazen display of quiet defiance. No one in this family ever told Susan to wait. Emily finished the second page, turning it over deliberately and slowly. She was claiming her power right in the middle of the dead silence, taking total control of the pacing. She was forcing 22 people to sit quietly, while as she meticulously reviewed the exact terms of her own dismissal. She felt a deep, steady calm radiating through her entire chest. The intense fear that had dictated her life for 5 long years was completely gone. She reached the final page. She read the very last line where the black ink formed a solid line for her signature. She smoothed the paper with the flat palm of her hand. She closed the thick manila folder, squaring the edges perfectly on the white tablecloth. She looked up the bright light from the crystal chandelier, catching brightly in her dark eyes. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at Susan. She turned her head, looking directly at the man sitting beside her. Mark was still staring at his crystal wine glass, entirely paralysed by his own profound cowardice. "Look at me," Emily said. Her voice was not loud. It was not a scream or a furious yell. It was incredibly soft, but it cut through the silent room with the sharp, devastating edge of absolute truth. Mark swallowed hard, his throat working frantically. He slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting hers for the very first time all evening. He looked entirely broken, completely terrified of the quiet, unyielding strength radiating from her posture. "You let them do this," Emily whispered, her voice carrying easily to every single corner of the large room. "You sat in our kitchen and you promised me that we were a team. You held me while I cried over my own failing body, and you promised me that we would figure it out together. And then you drove me here knowing your father was going to slide these papers across the turkey." Mark opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked quickly at his father silently, begging for help, begging for Richard to intervene and save him. But Richard just watched, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face an unreadable mask. "I spent 5 years," Emily continued, keeping her gaze locked solely on her husband. "I spent 5 years absorbing every single insult, every single demand, every single cruel expectation that your family threw at me. I swallowed my own dignity every single Sunday just so you could eat your dinner in absolute peace. I was your shield, Mark. I was the dedicated buffer standing right between you and the terrible disappointment of your own parents." Emily paused, taking a slow, fortifying breath. The room was absolutely spellbound, completely captivated by the raw, bleeding honesty of her words. She was not the hysterical, failing wife they had all expected. She was a strong woman, speaking her absolute truth with heartbreaking, devastating clarity. "And the very minute I stepped aside," Emily said, her voice completely steady, completely devoid of any tears, "the very minute I asked you to stand up for yourself, you completely collapsed. You let them blame me for the empty nursery. You let them blame me for the failing legacy. You let them fire me from this family because it was infinitely easier than telling them the truth. You are the weakest man I have ever known." The words hung in the air, incredibly heavy and entirely permanent. Mark closed his eyes, a single hot tear finally escaping and rolling down his flushed cheek. He had absolutely nothing to say, because every single word she spoke was the undeniable, agonizing truth. Emily reached her hand out across the crisp white tablecloth. Her fingers closed around the heavy gold fountain pen that Richard had placed there. The metal was still slightly warm from his pocket. She did not tremble as she pulled it toward her. She uncapped the pen, the small click sounding like a lock finally snapping open. She smoothed the thick white paper of the final page with her left hand. She pressed the gold nib against the solid black line. The scratch of the pen was incredibly loud in the dead silence. She wrote her first name with slow, deliberate loops. She wrote her last name, the name she had borrowed from them for 5 exhausting years. She took her time making sure every single letter was perfectly legible. She signed the second copy, and then the third, moving methodically through the legal stack. She felt a massive, invisible weight physically lifting off her chest with every single stroke of the dark black ink. She was not signing away her future. She was officially buying back her own freedom. Richard let out a slow, deeply satisfied breath. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully managed the uncomfortable crisis, restoring perfect order to his carefully curated family. He relaxed back into his heavy wooden chair, a smug, victorious look settling over his sharp features. Susan reached for her crystal glass of white wine, a triumphant, completely relieved smile finally breaking across her face. They thought the messy business was completely concluded. Emily placed the heavy gold pen back on the table. She closed the thick manila folder, pushing it precisely 1 single inch toward the center of the table. It was done. The legal tie was completely severed. She looked at Mark again. He was staring at the closed folder, his face a perfect picture of absolute pathetic misery. He had not moved a single muscle to stop her. He had let his father dictate the absolute end of his own marriage. "I am not signing these," Emily said quietly, "because I am broken. I am signing them because I am finally completely whole. You never wanted an actual partner, Mark. You just wanted a convenient passenger, someone to sit quietly in the dark while your father completely drove the car. You wanted someone to absorb the bumps so you would never have to feel the rough road." Mark squeezed his eyes shut as if the soft-spoken truth was physically blinding him. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice barely a fragile breath, completely lost in the massive, elegant room. "I know you are," Emily replied, feeling a strange, detached sense of pity wash over her. "But your apologies are exactly like your promises. They are entirely empty. You let me believe for 5 agonizing years that my own body was actively failing our marriage. You watched me cry on the cold tiles of our bathroom floor, punishing myself for something I could not possibly control. You let your own mother hand me aggressive brochures for luxury fertility clinics, knowing exactly why they would never ever work." Susan paused, her crystal wine glass hovering right in front of her painted lips. She frowned, clearly confused by Emily's very specific choice of words. Richard narrowed his eyes, leaning slightly forward, sensing a sudden, unexpected shift in the neat narrative he thought he completely controlled. The easy victory was suddenly turning into something highly unpredictable. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his booming voice losing a fraction of its polished corporate armor. "We all know the unfortunate medical struggles you brought into this family. There is absolutely no need to rewrite the established history just to save your own fragile pride, Emily. The papers are signed. Do not make this any more undignified than it already is." Emily did not look at Richard. She refused to give him the respect of her attention. She kept her eyes locked solely on Mark, watching the sheer, absolute panic finally completely overtake his pale features. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He knew the massive, cowardly lie was finally backed securely into a corner. "Tell them," Emily whispered, leaning just a fraction of an inch toward her terrified husband. "Tell your powerful father exactly why we never needed those expensive fertility clinics. Tell him why the legacy was never actually in danger from me. Be a grown man, Mark, for the very first time in your entire life." Mark shook his head, a tiny, frantic, desperate movement. "Please," he begged silently, mouthing the single word without making a single audible sound. He was still begging her to be his reliable shield. Even now, with the signed divorce papers sitting right between them on the table, he desperately wanted her to protect him from the booming judgment of the man sitting at the head of the table. He wanted her to walk away, carrying his massive secret straight out the front door. Emily sat back in her chair, resting her hands calmly in her lap. She felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. She had done her part. She had signed the legal papers reclaiming her absolute freedom from their toxic grip. She had spoken her truth, refusing to carry his shameful, heavy secrets for 1 second longer. "I am done protecting you," Emily said, her voice soft and entirely final. She turned her head, looking slowly down the long, silent dining table. The 22 faces were completely frozen, staring at her in absolute shock. She found Clara sitting perfectly still in the heavy mahogany chair. Clara had watched the entire exchange, her sharp, paralegal mind tracking every single detail. The moment had finally arrived. The grand stage was completely set, the arrogant audience was absolutely captive, and the false, comfortable narrative was entirely fractured. Emily gave Clara a single, definitive, microscopic nod. The invisible baton was officially passed. It was time to burn the rest of their perfect illusion straight to the completely ruined ground. Clara pushed her heavy wooden chair slowly backward. The loud scrape of the wooden legs against the patterned carpet sounded incredibly harsh in the completely silent room. She stood up, smoothing the dark fabric of her sharp dress. She did not rush. She picked up her black leather purse, unfastening the metal clasp with a soft, distinct click. Everyone at the table turned their heads, watching her sudden, unexpected movement. She reached inside, pulling out a thick brown manila envelope. It looked exactly like the one Richard had just pushed across the white tablecloth. She walked around the edge of the long dining table. Her dark heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood border of the large room. She walked with the absolute unyielding confidence of a seasoned paralegal walking straight into a hostile courtroom. She bypassed the younger cousins and the wealthy business partners. She stopped exactly at the head of the table, standing right next to Richard. He looked up at her, his thick eyebrows drawing together in profound, sudden confusion. "Excuse me," Richard said, his booming voice laced with heavy irritation. "This is a private family matter. You are a guest, Clara. I must ask you to please sit back down and allow us to finish this unfortunate business." "I am not sitting down," Clara replied, her voice ringing out clear and sharp. "And this business is absolutely not finished. Emily just signed your paperwork, Richard. She gave you exactly what you aggressively demanded. But before she walks out of this elegant room, you are going to look at what I brought you." Clara held the thick brown envelope out toward him. She held it steady right over his empty white china plate. Richard stared at it completely, refusing to raise his hand. He was a wealthy, powerful man, entirely accustomed to handing things to other people. He was absolutely not accustomed to being handed demands by a younger woman in his own rented dining room. "What is the meaning of this?" Susan demanded, her voice rising in genuine alarm. "Mark, tell your cousin's girlfriend to stop this ridiculous, dramatic display. We have had enough embarrassing outbursts for one holiday evening." Mark did not say a single word. He was physically trembling, his eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the massive, unavoidable impact. "Open the envelope," Clara instructed, keeping her dark eyes locked securely on Richard. "If you truly care about absolute honesty and the legacy of your family, you will open it right now. Or I can stand here and read the contents completely out loud to every single business partner sitting at this table." Richard felt the distinct, uncomfortable shift in the room's energy. The 22 guests were watching him, completely captivated by the sudden standoff. He could not look weak in front of his wealthy peers. He let out a loud, frustrated breath. He snatched the brown envelope from Clara's steady hand, tearing the paper flap open with unnecessary force. He pulled out the crisp white medical documents. He unfolded the paper, adjusting his posture to project complete, dismissive authority. He looked down at the dark blue ink of the clinic logo. He expected a bill or perhaps an angry letter. He did not expect a certified medical record. His eyes scanned the top line reading his own son's name and his date of birth. He frowned his corporate mind, struggling to process the unexpected private information. He read the middle section, elective bilateral vasectomy. He read the date stamped clearly next to the doctor's signature. It was dated 4 years ago, long before Emily ever attended a single Sunday dinner, long before Susan ever started mailing passive-aggressive fertility brochures, long before Richard ever started demanding a proper heir to carry the family name. The colour drained entirely from Richard's flushed face. The deep, arrogant red of his cheeks vanished in a single terrifying second. He looked exactly like a man who had just been struck by a heavy, invisible train. His mouth fell slightly open, his breath catching audibly in his throat. He read the medical document again, and then a third time, desperately searching for a mistake, searching for a way to deny the undeniable truth staring right back at him. "It is a certified medical record," Clara stated, her voice slicing cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence. "Sourced directly from a private urology clinic up in Evanston. Your son made a permanent surgical decision to never have children, Richard. He did it entirely by choice 4 years ago." A collective massive gasp rippled down the long mahogany table. The cousins looked at Mark, their eyes wide in absolute shock. The business partners suddenly found the intricate patterns on the carpet incredibly interesting, desperately trying to avoid the massive fallout. Susan gripped the edge of the white tablecloth, her manicured nails digging into the heavy fabric. She looked at her husband, completely unable to comprehend the sudden, violent destruction of their perfect narrative. Richard slowly lowered the white paper. The heavy gold fountain pen still sat on the table, a completely useless, forgotten object. He turned his head, looking down the table at his trembling son. The anger in Richard's eyes was no longer directed at Emily. It was a cold, profound, devastating fury aimed directly at his own flesh and blood. Mark shrank back in his heavy wooden chair, trying to disappear into the expensive grey suit. He opened his mouth to speak, but the lie he had protected for 5 long years was completely exposed under the bright crystal chandelier. "He let you blame Emily," Clara said, driving the final devastating point straight home. "He let you humiliate her, and he let you slide those divorce papers across this table because he was entirely too cowardly to tell you the truth. She was never the broken one, Richard. She was just the convenient shield for your lying son." The heavy silence in the dining room was completely absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty completely fracturing right down its very centre. Richard kept his eyes locked onto his trembling son. The white medical document fluttered slightly in his shaking hand. Susan was completely frozen, her mouth forming a silent, horrified shape. She looked from her husband to Mark, and then finally she looked at Emily. The arrogant, triumphant smile she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone. Mark finally found his voice, a desperate, pathetic croak in the back of his throat. "Dad," Mark pleaded, reaching a hand out toward the head of the table. "I can explain. I just did not want to disappoint you. I knew how much the legacy meant to you." Richard slammed his open palm flat against the mahogany table. The loud crack made the crystal wine glasses physically jump. "Do not speak to me," Richard roared, his face a terrifying shade of deep crimson. "You sat at this table for 5 entire years, and you let me treat this woman like she was the problem. You let your own mother agonize over an empty nursery while you hid behind a surgical lie. You are absolutely pathetic." Emily watched the destruction of their toxic, dynamic feeling, a profound, untouchable calm. She slowly pushed her chair back, the sound barely registering in the tense room. She stood up, smoothing the dark fabric of her navy dress. She picked up her small purse, feeling the solid weight of the glossy sonogram resting safely inside. The attention of the entire room instantly shifted back to her standing figure. They expected her to relish in the petty victory. They expected her to laugh at their absolute humiliation. But Emily did not laugh. She looked at Richard and then she looked at Susan. "Your son made a choice," Emily said, her voice cutting clearly through the heavy air. "He made a permanent decision to end your precious legacy, and he let you both punish me for it every single Sunday for 5 long years. But the universe has a very strange sense of humour, and biology does not care at all about your carefully managed secrets." She reached into her dark purse. She pulled out the small square photograph, holding it firmly between her fingers. She did not hand it to Richard. She did not hand it to Mark. She simply held it up so the bright light from the crystal chandelier illuminated the blurry grey image. "This is a sonogram," Emily announced, stating the impossible fact to the silent room. "I am exactly 8 weeks pregnant." A second massive wave of shock physically hit the long table. Susan gasped out loud, dropping her cloth napkin onto the floor. Richard stared at the small photograph, his corporate mind completely failing to process the absolute contradiction. "That is impossible," Richard stated, his voice completely hollow. "Clara just handed me the surgical records. He had a permanent procedure. It carries a failure rate of less than 1%, Emily explained, keeping her voice incredibly steady. "It is a documented medical rarity. But it happened. The procedure healed itself entirely on its own. I am carrying a child." Mark stared at her stomach, his eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. He tried to stand up his chair, scraping loudly against the carpet. Emily Mark breathed out, taking a single step toward her. "We are having a baby. We can fix this. We can tear up those papers right now." Emily took a deliberate step back, putting a solid wall of distance between them. She looked at him with a cold, absolute finality. "We are not having a baby," Emily corrected him, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am having a baby. You permanently signed away your right to this marriage exactly 5 minutes ago. You slid those separation papers right across this table, and I signed them, and you sat there completely silent while your father fired me." She turned her gaze back to Richard and Susan. They were staring at her, a sudden, desperate hunger replacing the shock in their eyes. They saw their precious legacy suddenly resurrected right in front of them. "Do not look at me like that," Emily commanded, raising her chin with fierce maternal protection. "This child is absolutely not your legacy. This child will never sit at this mahogany table and listen to you boom about expectations. This child will never learn to hide their true self just to appease your toxic judgment. This child belongs entirely to me, and to my mother, and to the people who actually know how to love without cruel conditions." She placed the sonogram safely back into her purse, snapping the clasp shut. The sharp sound echoed like a final gavel strike in the elegant room. "You can keep your money," Emily said, looking at Richard one last time. "You can keep your summer house and your country club memberships. And you can keep your cowardly son. I am leaving with the only thing that actually matters." She turned her back on the 22 stunned faces. She walked past the heavy wooden chairs, past the silver serving trays, and past the towering floral arrangements. Clara joined her side, matching her steady, unhurried pace. They walked out of the private dining room together, leaving the completely shattered family to sit in the ruins of their own making. They walked down the long, heavily carpeted hallway. The muffled sound of the jazz radio grew louder as they approached the front desk. Emily handed the young attendant her numbered ticket, retrieving her long wool coat. She pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the cold November night. The freezing air hit her flushed cheeks, feeling incredibly sharp and wonderfully clean. She took a massive, deep breath, filling her lungs with the absolute profound taste of total freedom. The dark sky above was clear and vast, and she was finally completely awake. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the soft jazz music completely. Emily stood on the top step of the wide stone staircase, looking out over the sprawling asphalt parking lot. The tall yellow street lamps cast long, dramatic shadows across the frozen grass. She pulled her dark wool coat tightly around her shoulders, shivering slightly in the sharp November wind. Clara stood right beside her, watching the white plumes of their breath disappear into the dark sky. "We should sit down," Clara suggested, her voice incredibly gentle, completely stripped of its earlier courtroom edge. "Your adrenaline is going to crash any second now, Emily." Emily nodded, feeling a sudden deep weakness in her knees. They walked down to the bottom step, sitting side by side on the cold, unforgiving stone. Emily wrapped her arms firmly around her own waist, holding herself together. "How do you feel?" Clara asked, bumping her shoulder lightly against Emily. "I feel like I just woke up," Emily whispered, staring out at the rows of parked, expensive cars. "I feel like I have been asleep for 5 entire years, Clara. And, finally, just open my eyes." "You did it perfectly," Clara said, leaning back on her gloved hands. "You let them build their own trap, and then you just let them walk right into it." The look on Richard's face was absolutely priceless. "I am going to frame that memory in my mind forever." Clara turned her head, looking back at the heavy brick facade of the expensive country club. From a purely legal standpoint, Clara added, her tone shifting into a practical, professional rhythm, "you handled that with absolute brilliance. You signed the documents establishing your total compliance with their initial demands. You let them feel completely victorious before you completely pulled the rug out from under them. You proved in front of 22 highly influential witnesses that you were completely willing to walk away with absolutely nothing just to escape their lying son." Emily listened to her friend, feeling a strange, hollow ache beneath the fading adrenaline. She had not planned it as a brilliant legal strategy. She had simply acted out of pure, desperate survival. She had needed Mark to look her in the eye and realize exactly what he was throwing away. She had needed him to hear the absolute truth completely out loud before she closed the door on him forever. But he had failed even at that. He had just stared at his crystal wine glass, shrinking away from the conflict exactly as he always did. A loud, muffled shout suddenly echoed from the heavy brick building right behind them. It was undeniably Richard, his booming voice vibrating straight through the thick, expensive walls. Emily could not make out the exact words, but she recognized the terrifying tone. It was the sound of a patriarch entirely losing control of his perfect, curated universe. He was finally directing his rage exactly where it belonged. He was tearing Mark completely apart. 5 years ago, Emily thought that sound would have sent me running back inside to apologize. I would have desperately tried to smooth it all over to protect Mark from his own father. But right now, it just sounds like distant traffic. It has absolutely nothing to do with me anymore. They are eating him alive in there. Clara noted a small, deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. Susan is probably crying into her cloth napkin, wondering how her perfect social standing is going to survive the country club rumours. And Mark is finally learning that cowardice has a very high, very public price. Emily placed her bare hand gently over her lower stomach. The thick wool coat was heavy and warm against her skin. She thought about the tiny flickering heartbeat on the grey monitor. She had just detonated a massive bomb right in the centre of their lives, and she was walking away carrying the absolute most valuable piece of the wreckage. "They are going to fight you," Clara said, quietly following Emily's movement, looking down at her hand. "Richard is not going to just let you walk away with his only grandchild. He is going to hire expensive lawyers, Emily. He is going to try to bury you in legal paperwork." "Let him try," Emily said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper.